Welcome, everyone. My name is Paul Hitchcock, Director of the School of International Political and Strategic Studies in the ANU College of Asia and the Pacific. And it's a pleasure to welcome you here today for the first public lecture that our school has had since its establishment just a few months ago on the 1st of January 2010. If you have a chance to look at our website, the address here, you'll see that our school, across its various units, prides itself on addressing the big questions of Asia-Pacific politics, whether in international relations, political and social change, strategic and defense studies, or state, society, and governance in Melanesia. Our speaker today, quite obviously, does not shy away from either big questions or big countries or big issues related to ties among big countries. David Malone is currently the president of Canada's International Development Research Centre, into which post he brings a wealth of diplomatic and scholarly experience. Prior to his work at IDRC, David served as Canada's High Commissioner to India and non-resident ambassador to Bhutan and Nepal. Other positions he has held include Assistant Deputy Minister for Global Issues in Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, President of the International Peace Academy in New York, and Canadian Ambassador to the United Nations. As if this isn't enough to keep him busy, David has published very extensively on a range of topics, including 5 volumes with Lynn Reiner between the years 2000 and 2007, a 1999 Oxford University Press book on UN Security Council decision-making processes as they relate to Haiti, a 2008 Oxford Press book on the law and practice of the United Nations, and a forthcoming 2001 book, also with Oxford, entitled Does the Elephant Dance? Contemporary Indian Foreign Policy. He also has an additional current research project involving analysis of the current governance crisis in Nepal. As diplomat scholar, David has held academic positions at Columbia University, the University of Toronto, Carleton University, and l'Institut d'études politiques in Paris. And he currently serves as adjunct professor at the New York University School of Law, as well as senior fellow of Massey College in the University of Toronto. David is here today with the generous support of the High Commission of Canada, and I want to thank in particular David MacKinnon, sitting over by the wall here, for making it possible for us to present this lecture. David is Deputy High Commissioner based here in Canberra. Today's lecture, which draws on analysis published just a couple months ago in the journal Survival, is entitled India and China, Can Two Tigers Share a Mountain? And it's a great pleasure to welcome you, David. We're delighted to have you here at the ANU.
Thank you. Should I stay here or speak from here? Probably better stand. Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and I'm also very grateful to David MacKinnon, with whom I worked in India, much to my benefit. ANU I visited only once before, in 1989, when I was just beginning my life of research, and I hadn't yet established myself in any way and was thoroughly disreputable in every way, in spite of which I received a warm welcome here, and I've never forgotten it, and I've always wanted to return. So I'm very happy that I am here today with you, and as last time, preceded by a very warm welcome. I have other links to Australia and Canada. My mother was an Australian. She was a war correspondent who married my father, a Canadian war correspondent, in 1940. And by 1942, they were both living in Canberra, where they lived for 6 years. Initially, my father was engaged in the so-called Wartime Information Board, which was actually the Allied propaganda operation. And later he converted to Canadian diplomacy. So I grew up on accounts of Canberra during the war years, when there were probably 10,000 people here, and they all seemed to have had a marvelous time. Secondly, a number of years ago, when the Lowy Institute was being created in Sydney, the institution I was working with in New York partnered with them a great deal in their early months and years, entirely again to our benefit in New York. It was a wonderful experience working with Alan Ginchel and Michael Fullilove, and it was great just recently seeing how well the Lowy Institute has done in subsequent years. Its reputation internationally, like that of ANU, has grown by leaps and bounds. Finally, I should mention that when I have served as a Canadian public servant, it's always been terrific working with Australian colleagues. We're very like-minded, but we also have very different thoughts because our parts of the world are very different. Our experience is rather different. So I was always able to learn a great deal from my Australian colleagues, not least while David and I were serving in India during years when Australia was represented particularly well in India, with an outstanding team led by John McCarthy, for whom Indians had enormous regard. And I should mention in passing, amongst the very few foreigners who have written well about Indian foreign policy, was an early Australian High Commissioner to India, who was actually High Commissioner twice in India, a guy called Crocker, who is constantly cited by Indian scholars of foreign policy, further to a book he wrote essentially on the Nehruvian period of Indian foreign policy, and which is well worth reading still, and from which I've benefited and which I cite in my own work. The effort I've undertaken to write about Indian foreign policy has been a labor of love. I enjoyed my years in India unreservedly, but Indian foreign policy is a challenging field and a very contested field, both within India and in terms of international appreciation of Indian foreign policy. One of the things I've enjoyed about it most has been working with 5 young Indian researchers who, of course, have very different ideas and opinions from me, and who have been wonderful research partners for me. And the work that I developed on India and China was in fact mostly developed by my young research partner Rohan Mukherjee, who's a doctoral student at Princeton University, and who has been not only a terrific research partner, but also enormous fun to work with. So in many ways, what I'll have to say today is a tribute to Rohan and how far down he was willing to drill into the topic. I should say at the outset that Western scholarship on countries like India is often very disappointing. Why is this? Because Western scholarship is actually quite lazy when it comes to Asia very often. Australia probably is an exception. When you read the great American books touching on India, it's Americans citing other Americans and quoting other Americans. They never think of citing any Indians or quoting any Indians on a topic that actually is shaped by Indians and not by Americans. And this is a problem in international relations literature fairly widely, that there are certain individuals who are quoted constantly no matter how little they actually have to contribute to a particular field of inquiry, while the people who actually know something are rarely cited. So in my own work, I've tried very hard to find out what Indians themselves thought at various times during the development of their foreign policy. And on the topic of India and China, Rohan and I spent a lot of time speaking to Chinese authorities in this area and reading them, and it was a very rewarding experience. There's a tremendous amount that can be drawn on by the people of the countries involved. And I mention this in passing simply because we are in a university, and how we source our work actually determines the outcome of how relevant it may be. On India and China, of course, the big story these days is their emergence on the world stage. But actually that isn't, in my view, the best way to think of India and China. It's more helpful to think of their re-emergence. Because historically, from about 500 BC onwards, those republics, empires, kingdoms that constituted China and India traditionally provided about half of world economic output, perhaps a little less than half, depending on the period. And that was true until about 1750. India might have provided about 20% of global economic output, China 25%. However, both countries suffered a vertiginous relative economic decline during the era of colonization. India was comprehensively colonized, China was economically colonized. The result for both countries was catastrophic. In the Western version of history, particularly the British version of history, the Raj was a huge success. All of those pretty pictures, all those tigers, all those elephants, wasn't it all fun? Well, it wasn't for the Indians, because they went from contributing 20% of world economic output to only 2% by the time the British left in 1947. You don't need to know much more about the Raj than that to realize just how exploitative it was. Indeed, the Brits were quite upfront about what the Raj was about. It was a project of economic exploitation of India, and as such, it was tremendously successful. China's more complicated when it comes to its decline. But it's hardly surprising that the leaders of the Indian national movement, of whom we mostly know Gandhi and Nehru, but there were many other interesting members of the leadership, took a rather different view of the British colonial experience in India. And when they started thinking about foreign policy, although Gandhi really didn't think much about foreign policy, but Nehru did, they formed the idea that India actually would be a very different type of actor in international relations than what they knew of the Western world, which was largely Britain. Nehru was a very sophisticated man and knew a great deal. The extent of Nehru's ambition in the mid-30s, 10 years before independence, when he spent quite a bit of time in jail, courtesy of the Brits, and had a lot of time on his hands to write. The extent of his ambition for an independent India was to exert a degree of leadership within Asia and to facilitate the process of fighting the colonialists underway in countries like Malaysia and Indonesia nearby. So it was to a degree an anti-British project very early on, Anglophile as Nehru was. In 1947, at India's independence, foreign policy was just about the last thing the leadership in India could devote a lot of time to. Partition had produced tremendous wounds in South Asia, from which the subcontinent has still not fully recovered. The Brits, who neglected India even more during their last 10 years of rule than they had earlier, presided over 2 major famines in India during the last 15 years of their rule. So there was a great deal to worry about of a domestic nature, both economically and in terms of the country's cohesion when India became independent. And of course, that was what Nehru mostly focused on. What was going on in China, of course, was a struggle over who was going to be governing China. Because just as India was becoming independent, the struggle for control of China was at its apex, as between the Kuomintang group and the communist insurgency in China. And what this leads me to is that modern China and modern India emerged on the world stage within 2 years of each other. 1949 in the case of China, 1947 in the case of India. So in that sense, there's a certain symmetry in their emergence as autonomous international actors. But their perspectives, as it turned out, were rather different. I mentioned that Nehru had the project of India exerting a degree of high-minded leadership in Asia, perhaps extending to Africa, hence the idea of the Afro-Asian conference that was important at Bandung in 1955. He also had the idea, when the communist regime emerged in China, without any apparent connections to the outside world, that India could facilitate the introduction of China into polite international society. And he set about doing that at Bandung and elsewhere, and thought that he was doing China a great favor. It did not seem that way to Zhou Enlai. Some years later, Zhou Enlai told a group of journalists that Nehru was the most arrogant man he had ever met. So India and China actually got off on fairly rough footing from pretty early on. And soon Tibet reared its head in the relationship. Many of you will recall that China militarily occupied Tibet in 1950. At first, that event may not have seemed pregnant with huge consequence for the relationship with India. India acquiesced fairly early on in Chinese control over Tibet, although it was rather grudgingly done. But conditions grew worse in Tibet under Chinese control during the 50s, and in 1959 the Dalai Lama fled Tibet, as you all will know, and he fled Tibet for India. Now, one thing most of us don't know, and that I certainly didn't know until quite recently, is this was actually a sequel to an earlier set of events initiated in 1909 when the Manchus in China invaded Tibet, took control of it, and the current Dalai Lama's immediate predecessor, the 13th Dalai Lama, fled Tibet for India. 3 years later, that Dalai Lama was able to return to Tibet, kick the Manchus out, and govern Tibet as a sovereign ruler for a number of years. So if you wonder why the Chinese government is nervous about the Dalai Lama sitting in India today, perhaps that historical anecdote helps explain the degree of Chinese agitation on the subject. The Dalai Lama's exit from Tibet, the current Dalai Lama's exit from Tibet in 1959 for India, accelerated a process of deterioration in relations between the two countries. If you look at a map of India, you will notice that Tibet overhangs all of North India. Tibet is a huge region, much bigger than it is in our imaginations. And so, in a sense, Tibet overhangs the relationship between India and China. India has very strong cultural and religious links to Tibet, in many ways the ultimate Buddhist country. The Chinese have always worried about the extent of Indian influence and interaction in Tibet. So it's a region, it's a zone psychologically of huge importance in the bilateral relationship between India and China. Again, much more than we tend to be aware of, because small events in the bilateral relationship between India and China simply aren't reported in the Western press. Hardly anything of international significance is now reported in the Western press, but particularly that bilateral relationship is hardly covered in the West. The bilateral relationship along the Tibet border went on declining, and in 1961, Nehru instituted an ill-fated so-called forward policy, which involved sending troops up to the border to gesticulate at the Chinese across the border, and perhaps even cross the border by a foot or two, of which Beijing took note. Beijing at the time was busy with a number of other difficulties, including some difficulties with Vietnam. But its attention returned to the border in 1962 when it suddenly invaded, rather successfully, large chunks of northern India, for which India, in spite of its forward policy, so-called, was completely unprepared. And so this led to a comprehensive defeat of India, although rather uncommonly, China withdrew to the previous border voluntarily on the last day of fighting. Perhaps not coincidentally on a day in which a US aircraft carrier steamed into the Bay of Bengal in moral support of the Indian position. That was the low point in the relationship between India and China. Of course, the Chinese tend to have forgotten largely that war. It's much easier to forget a war if you win it than if you lose it. The Indians who lost it haven't forgotten it at all. Indeed, it's the single factor in their international relations that's most present in their minds. That particular event, or set of events in 1962. For those who think that Pakistan is the obsession in Indian foreign policy, it is an obsession in Indian foreign policy. For those who think the relationship with the US must be the most important thing, both views are wrong. The most important relationship for India is the relationship with China, for good and ill, and it features both. When China tested its first nuclear device in 1974, everybody in the West thought that was about Pakistan, of course. But it wasn't. It was about achieving nuclear parity with China. China had tested its own weapon in 1964. It took 10 years for the Indians to catch up with them, but they did. And when India tested more decisively nuclear weapons in 1998, the then sitting government of India, in a letter to Washington that was leaked accidentally on purpose, one can only imagine, forthright attributed its nuclear tests on the Chinese threat, in case there was any doubt about what their tests were about. Today, I'd say on the nuclear front, having achieved parity, Indians are pretty relaxed about China's nuclear arsenal, just as in a strange way, Pakistan and India are relatively relaxed about each other's nuclear arsenals, because nuclear arsenals are useful as deterrents, but nobody imagines seriously using nuclear weapons, even in very tense interstate situations like India, Pakistan, or in some perhaps unknown circumstances, India and China. But I did think it worth pointing to the fact that the nuclear tests were clearly pinned by New Delhi on a Chinese threat rather than a Pakistani threat. In 1999, on the other hand, China having reacted rather sharply to this rude letter that was so deliberately leaked, a shift in Chinese policy occurred having to do with India and Pakistan. As of about 1955, perhaps as a result of finding India hard to bear on the international stage, China had established what is today one of the most enduring alliances in international relations with Pakistan. And it's an alliance that has been through very few downs, many ups, and is pretty solid. But in 1999, for the first time in a dispute between India and Pakistan, the Chinese didn't side with Pakistan. They decided to remain neutral. This was the Kargil campaign, the ill-advised Kargil campaign by General Musharraf, which was a very risky maneuver that ended badly for Pakistan. The Chinese announced at the time that this was a bilateral dispute between two countries and that they should solve it themselves rather than backing up Pakistan. And since then, China overtly has remained pretty neutral in Indo-Pakistani disputes. So that's a fundamental shift in Chinese policy as of 1999. Brought about, I think, by the recklessness of Musharraf in undertaking the Kargil campaign. So far my account has been historical, and deliberately so, because history really matters in relations between countries. Models of relations between countries can't incorporate historical factors easily, and consequently underrate the importance of history, which is, as between countries like India and China, great and certainly much greater than other factors. I now turn to some cross-cutting issues, but before doing so, I wanted to mention that, in fact, while India and China are re-emerging at the same time, and we all pay attention to the two countries because of their economic growth, in fact, the rise of the two countries, or re-emergence of the two countries, is very asymmetrical in a number of ways, and I wanted to come to those asymmetries. First, on economic relations. The path China took to economic growth is very different from the path India took to economic growth. If you think of China under Deng Xiaoping, because that was the period in which reforms were instituted in China and accelerated growth of a sustained nature got underway, those reforms essentially started with agricultural reforms, which were preceded by experimentation to see what would work for China rather than dogma, which had been the encouragement under Mao, and then moved on to manufacturing and a great deal of focus on infrastructure such that the manufacturing could be managed and exported successfully. India, on the other hand, had been through a green revolution during the 1960s and 70s that seemed to be a huge success at the time and did achieve progress in agricultural production, but turned out to be premised on unsustainable terms. Unsustainable use of water, which is quite scarce in parts of India, and excessive use of sometimes toxic fertilizer, such that productivity growth in Indian agriculture essentially stopped in the late 80s and hasn't moved forward much since. And the Indian economic reforms were instituted about 12 years after China's, and only because of a singular event, India went broke in 1990. It was insolvent. Most of us have forgotten that. And thus it was under dire conditions of dire necessity and national distress that an otherwise very passive Indian government was moved to believe that economic reforms might be a good idea, and the current Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, who had clear ideas on what these economic reforms might consist of, was invited to be Finance Minister of India. And that was the onset of the economic reform process in India, which has followed a completely different path of that in China. They had a degree of liberalization in common, but as you all know, the great Indian success story has been largely in services rather than in manufacturing or agriculture. And India failed to focus on infrastructure, such that today India faces a huge infrastructure deficit, not just in relation to China, but in relation to just about every other major country, and today needs to focus very, very seriously on developing its infrastructure if it wishes its manufacturing sector to take off, which it could well do. The trade relations between the two countries, unnoticed in the West, China has become India's principal trading partner, passing the United States last year, about $50 billion in trade between the two countries. But it's very lopsided to China's advantage. Indian editorialists complain about China flooding India in shoddy goods. This is simply the obverse side of the medal of India failing to flood China with its shoddy goods. Our Indian friends need to focus on what they're doing wrong rather than complaining about what the Chinese seem to be doing right. And I'm sure fertile minds in Delhi and elsewhere in India are focused on this today. What's lacking in the bilateral economic relationship is much cross-investment between the two countries, and investment is actually more important than trade in the world today. The Indians, I think, regrettably, restrict Chinese investment in India on so-called security grounds in all sorts of sectors. Chinese are fairly open to Indian investment, but there just hasn't been very much yet. So the relationship between the two countries will become genuinely mature economically when investment starts to flow seriously back and forth between them, and that may not be far off in years ahead, because the importance of cross-investment is understood in both countries. Geostrategically, I mentioned that Tibet has overhung the relationship for many years now. Before that, of course, the Himalayas constituted a powerful barrier between the two countries, and it was actually quite difficult, except by sea, to get from one to the other. But geostrategically today, there's a great game afoot amongst geostrategists. It's a great parlor game, and the key word is encirclement. So the Indian security establishment, which is always looking for reasons why India should spend more money on defense than it does, has identified Chinese encirclement of India as the principal claim they can advance. And indeed, there are reasons to believe that China is somewhat encircling India. If you look at harbor facilities that have been developed by China, purportedly for local use, in Burma, soon in Bangladesh, already in Sri Lanka, and Gwadar in Pakistan, those are facts on the ground that suggest China is indeed interested in developing the capacity to encircle India with at least Chinese-built naval installations. Furthermore, China, which hadn't been very present in the Indian Ocean until recently, now is very present in the Indian Ocean, steaming back and forth between Africa in search of resources and otherwise spreading the wings of its navy, so to speak. And this is unnerving for India, the single most distinguished armed forces branch of which is its own navy, a very competent naval establishment in India. But that's the Indian story. What might the Chinese story be? Well, the Chinese read the Wall Street Journal like other people, and they wonder about these stories of strategic alliances between the United States, India, Australia, and Japan. What might that be about? Is there no Chinese content to those stories, they might wonder, in Beijing? So encirclement plays both ways, and while there is reality to it, it's also important not to read too much into it, because if you become obsessed with geostrategic parlor games, next thing you know, you're spending all your budget on military activities, dinky toys that float, and so on. Geostrategically, the one thing that's been significant in both Chinese policy and Indian policy laterally is that both countries have started investing a great deal of effort in the rest of Asia. China quite quickly, after Deng Xiaoping took over, India announcing a so-called Look East policy in the early 90s and promptly forgetting to do anything about it, but picking up the initiative again about 10 years ago and being quite serious about it over the last 10 years. So while China is ahead of the game in particularly Southeast Asia, India's picked up very energetically over the last 10 years, and the Southeast Asian countries like Indian engagement because it provides a bit of a balance. Some of them worry about excessive, perhaps Chinese engagement with their own countries, agreeable as that sometimes is, and actually welcome, in my experience, India's involvement. And of course, historically, civilizationally, there have been links between India and most of Southeast Asia over millennia, not just centuries. So in that sense, it's nothing new. Multilaterally, what can be said? Well, China, somewhat to India's puzzlement, emerged as having very much the upper hand in the multilateral sphere. China lucked into a permanent seat in the UN Security Council when Taiwan was exchanged for Beijing at the UN in 1971. It didn't really use its permanent seat for a very long time. It was extremely prudent and mainly observed events around it at the UN, but it had the permanent seat. And as its economy started growing and it became a much more user-friendly state internationally, China was able in various unthreatening ways to join a number of clubs that India had already been a member of for many years, and India found itself in Chinese company that seemed to have at least as much pull as it did. For India, not having a permanent seat in the Security Council has been a sort of micro-obsession, less in recent years now that China and India have both joined the G20, that India pretty well can belong to any international club it wants to, except apparently the UN Security Council. It's no longer a huge issue in India, but it was a great irritant in Indian foreign policy thinking and in Indian strategic thinking for quite a while, particularly as China had a permanent seat. Now, one thing, again, we haven't noticed enormously in the West is how many clubs have emerged involving India and China that don't involve any of the rest of us. So a great deal of Chinese and Indian diplomacy is spent on forums that don't involve Australia or Canada, to cite a couple of countries. Let me mention a few of these. The BRIC Forum, which is a strange forum because it's 3 emerging countries and 1 declining country, but nevertheless it gathered some steam, and indeed a BRIC summit was taking place in Brazil late last week, the 2nd BRIC summit, the previous one having been held in Russia. But there are plenty of other forums. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, propelled by Russia and China. India is only an observer, as are Pakistan and Iran, but it would love to be a member, because the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is focused on Central Asia, with which India has had historic ties and which in the Indian imagination has great significance for it, and indeed economically could have great significance in terms of natural resources. India has launched a forum with Brazil and South Africa called IPSA, which describes itself as the 3 leading democracies of their continents, and in which their leaders are investing a great deal of effort, and in which the business content is increasing significantly, and in the West nobody's noticed IPSA, because we aren't conditioned to notice things that don't involve ourselves, by and large. BASIC, quite interesting BASIC, Brazil, South Africa, India and China. This was the group with which Obama wound up cutting his deal in Copenhagen. Absent were any other Western countries. The United States is quite comfortable to deal with any country or group of countries that is relevant to its designs and interests. And if that excludes the Europeans, Canada or Australia, that's perfectly okay. So that was something I think a number of participants in Copenhagen woke up to late in the day. It wasn't in and of itself terribly significant, but what it told us is that Brazil, South Africa, China and India as a group of countries are more significant than the West put together for the United States, and that is new. And that's a change in a way under Obama. I'm not sure this would have happened under a previous American administration. BASIC plus Mexico, by the way, because Mexico is the 5th emerging country that often participates in activities of the other 4, just as Russia plays in occasionally to the activities or diplomatic strategies of Brazil, South Africa, India and China. And so it's worth keeping an eye on Mexico. We tend to forget about it in analysis of international relations, but its role in multilateral diplomacy is growing very fast. And of course, it also is a member of the G20. So all sorts of diplomacy clubs that don't involve us, but that are actually very important to India, China, and some of the other countries I've mentioned. How to conclude? Can India and China share a mountain? Yes, very gingerly. Because, as I've mentioned, there are a number of difficulties in their relationship, and Tibet can remain a wild card, particularly at a time when the current Dalai Lama is getting older and no healthier, and alas, his succession has to be envisaged. Ideas about who should succeed the Dalai Lama will probably be rather different in New Delhi than they are from Beijing. The Indians will likely support whatever option the Dalai Lama favors during the remainder of his life, while Beijing will be developing its own options on succession of the Dalai Lama, indeed is already developing its own options on succession to the Dalai Lama, and that could introduce a moment of at least some tension between the two countries, although it might not. My own sense is that the growing economic relationship is a terrific shock absorber in the relationship between the two countries, because it's significant enough that it may well be that neither country wants to put that amount of business at risk by shadow boxing or worse with each other in the future. I'll stop there, but I'll look forward to your remarks, and if there are any questions, I can try and answer them. So thank you very much for your attention. Rick?
Are there questions? Here, please. If you could identify yourself.
Yeah, I am Professor Adesh Sharma. I am from Delhi School of Economics. You very rightly, put the similarity in certain aspects between India and China. But as a teacher, I would like to learn it from you, because you have a great deal of foreign policy. What I see is that in India and China, they have taken all of their financial resources, which the world today talk about excessive financialization, as an end in itself, rather than as a means. Can you put a highlight on it, please?
Perhaps because I know India better than China, I'll respond on India. As you would know better than I do, there's a great deal of comment in India, not least by the Prime Minister himself, about how Indians have allowed themselves to be carried away by the fabulousness of their own economic success story. And India's Prime Minister, an alumnus of the Delhi School of Economics like yourself, often makes the point publicly in India that for India to think of itself as a superpower or any sort of power is grotesque at a time when India still has somewhere between 300 million and 800 million very, very poor people. So there is a debate, a very lively debate in India over how important international relations themselves are, and international posturing and bragging about economic success at a time when so much of the population remains poor. I'd also like to bring into the equation Japan. Why does nobody take much interest in Japan anymore except the Japanese and one or two American geostrategists? Well, although Japan remains the second economy in the world, depending on how you count the statistics, how you do your sums, rivaled by China obviously now, because it has been stagnating for about 15 years, it has no forward momentum. So what one must conclude is what international commentators are interested in is forward motion and momentum rather than actual performance. And it's on the basis of momentum rather than actual performance that China and India both seem so very compelling. Even there's a sharp distinction to be made. I mentioned that China started its path towards sustainable growth in the very late 1970s. India only in the early 1990s. Secondly, China has consistently been growing several percentage points more than India. India some years 9%, China 11.5%. During the economic slowdown, India perhaps 6–7%, China perhaps 8–9%. But over many years, those gaps compound, such that the performance gap between India and China has actually compounded rather than diminished over the years. And China emerges as, in terms of total economic production, a much bigger actor than India today. So a lot of facile international analysis of India and China, first of all, links them as the same phenomenon. There are links, but there are also many differences and asymmetries. And secondly, doesn't take a great deal of account of domestic factors in the two countries, which are tremendously different as between China and India. Indeed, two systems more different one couldn't conceive of. In China, absolute poverty has been shrunk, but there are still about 200 million very poor people in China. That is a source of concern in Beijing, and you can see how much of a source of concern it was during the recent economic downturn. And in India, in political terms, poverty in India is much more important than a permanent seat in New York, because of the poor vote in India. So doing something for the poor effectively is, for any politician in India, a more urgent preoccupation than international posturing. So my remarks didn't capture any of that. I'm very grateful to you for posing a question that brought that out.
In the back there, Andrew.
Andrew Phillips, Department of International Relations at ANU. Very much enjoyed your presentation. I was particularly intrigued when you were talking about the fears of encirclement among the Indian military establishment. And basically my question comes in two parts. Firstly, to what extent that concern resonates outside of the Indian military establishment? Does it in fact inform more broadly India's diplomatic and strategic outlook? And secondly, as a corollary to that, to the extent that it does resonate, what is India doing diplomatically, economically and militarily to counter the perceived fear of encirclement through China's string of pearls strategy and the other things that you're talking about?
Thank you. Well, my perception is, but it's highly arguable, that India did do something very significant about this, but at American initiative. Students of American foreign policy are usually drawn to the geostrategic dimensions of it. But in fact, in my experience, American policy is often shaped by commercial objectives. And while India wasn't of huge interest to the United States until its economic reforms, once India started growing, what the United States saw in India was a huge market beginning to develop. And so as of the mid-1990s, a number of smart people in Washington and elsewhere started to wonder in the United States how to engage with India and overcome the legacy of a very painful relationship through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In the late 1990s, at the time of the Cargill, the Cargill fiasco, the United States engaged in a bit of mediation between Pakistan and India, welcomed by both sides, and then stayed on for a conversation with India. And the two people leading the conversation, Jaswant Singh, who was the very accomplished Foreign Minister of India at the time, and Strobe Talbot, Deputy Secretary of State and great writer and scholar, today the head of the Brookings Institution, each wrote a book about it, or largely about their conversation. The position of the two countries was still too far apart and weighed down by the legacy of history. But Strobe had developed the idea that if India and the US could talk sensibly about the nuclear sphere in their policy, perhaps that would allow them to overcome their past differences. But the clock ran out, the Clinton administration ran out, the Democrats weren't re-elected, the Bush administration was in. And for the first 4 years, the Bush administration paid no particular attention to India. But as of its re-election, it engaged India with very single-minded intensity, very much focused on Strobe's idea of nuclear cooperation as a way of exiting a very sour nuclear relationship that had developed after the US arranged for India to be isolated following its 1974 nuclear test. India was in a nuclear pariah status after 1974 that the US had arranged for it. So the Bush administration came also to believe that overcoming this nuclear hurdle in the relationship was the single most constructive vector of effort. And India and the US engaged very intensively over a 3-year period, with the rest of the world watching very closely, and China watching very closely, as to whether they would be able to agree with each other on terms that would govern India's emergence from nuclear pariah status. They did agree in 2008, and the United States had very cleverly, the cleverness of American diplomacy is often underrated, organized their agreement that in order to be operationalized, it had to be endorsed not just by the board of the International Atomic Energy Agency, but had to be endorsed unanimously by the nuclear suppliers group of about 44 countries that have nuclear capacities of one sort or another. So that put everybody else, including China, on the spot. Was anybody prepared to challenge this arrangement between the United States and India? Exceptionally clever of the United States to have done it this way, because once everybody had been consulted and consented, however grudgingly, they had no further basis on which to complain. The general analysis in India was somehow that New Delhi had sold the shop to the American Satan, whereas internationally the consensus was that the Indians had walked away with a very good deal, and the Bush administration had managed to develop for itself the sole positive legacy item to come from Bush's foreign policy. So the relationship between the United States and India is qualitatively quite different now from what it was before these events. There will continue to be lots of disputes between the countries, but in fact the relationship is one of affinity and overall friendship, whatever the disputes are, and that must have been taken note of by China in its own scan of world conditions before 2008 and after 2008. Does any of this threaten China? No, because India has no intention of becoming a pawn in Washington's designs. Rather, it makes it possible for India to play on several fields at once, and that is a big advantage for India. And of course, China must be aware of that advantage. But it hasn't made India subservient to Washington, although a number of commentators within India claim it has. Indeed, the Obama administration, which had campaigned on policy of trying to solve the Kashmir problem in order to solve the Afghan problem, realizing that India was fundamentally opposed to that, backed off very quickly during the transition period, and that idea hasn't been heard of since. So not only will India not follow Washington blindly, occasionally Washington will have to bow to India as well in the future.
My name is Nishank. I'm from the master's student in the Graduate Studies in Strategy and Defense program. I wanted to ask you, well, in the context of the China-India relationship, it's becoming increasingly difficult for India to bridge the trust deficit, especially with China's encirclement of India and its relationship with Pakistan. In my point of view, I would say that for India-China relations to improve, from India's perspective, China would actually have to fundamentally alter its relationship with Pakistan, given that China supported Pakistan in its nuclear and missile program and helped in Pakistan's militarization. So with China and Pakistan actually forging a closer relationship, it threatens India's security interests. Would just like to know what you have to think about that.
Well, first off, on Pakistan, you're quite right that China had a great deal to do with Pakistan developing nuclear weapons, but the US has had a great deal to do with boosting Pakistan's conventional military capacities. So how you view alliances depend on what you're looking for. If you're looking for a problem involving China, you talk about the nuclear issue in Pakistan. But if you're looking at the overall Pakistani military arsenal, then the United States may be more significant than China. So it's always very important to try to be relatively dispassionate and look beyond simply one thing. But I'm very glad you've raised this, because many commentators in India are still quite worried about the Chinese relationship with Pakistan. In fact, my perception is that, as I mentioned earlier, China has become much more cautious about Pakistan, both in terms of Pakistani-India relations, but perhaps more generally. After the Mumbai bombings, there was no doubt that China's diplomacy at the UN suggested serious discomfort with the initial response of the Pakistani government to the Mumbai bombings. Secondly, China is very concerned about its outer borders, what it often thinks of as its soft borders. It shares with India a dislike of terrorism, and it shares with India a fear of Islamic terrorists spinning out of control out of Pakistan. So I think your sense of China and Pakistan, it might be worth filling it out somewhat and thinking of the entirety of relationships and the complexity of relationships. It's never a good idea in diplomacy when you're dealing with a more powerful partner to tell them what they have to do. Never works to tell more powerful people what they have to do. Not a good idea for India to cast its diplomacy in terms of what China has to do. One of India's greatest challenges in managing diplomacy with China, and it's a tribute to its political system, is the vibrantly free press in India, the raucously free parliament of India, both of which are obsessed with China, such that all sorts of rude things are said about China and India on a regular basis with enthusiastic abandon, whereas the Chinese, with no free press and a highly controlled diplomatic messaging system, say no more than they intend to say. And so actually China has a huge advantage in managing diplomacy with India, because the Indian government is often stuck with public debates over which it has no control, which are often aimed at embarrassing it, the Indian government, but sideswipe China, offending Chinese sensibilities considerably, while the Chinese calibrate their messaging on India and only allow a rude tone to creep into it by design. They did so once or twice last year, but haven't done so since. So there, in terms of India-China relations, something we all admire and like in India, its tremendously successful democratic performance, is actually a disadvantage in managing a relationship with a partner as controlled and strategic as China.
Questions?
Ian McLean, University of Canberra. Does Singapore have a role in, and perhaps Malaysia, in greasing the wheels, perhaps, or sharing the mountain between India and China?
Singapore has played a very important and positive role, I'd say. First of all, regionally, in general terms, it's become the hub for all sorts of things in Asia. Secondly, their diplomacy tends to be very discreet. They manifest their intent often through positive investment signals rather than diplomatic posturing. such that Singapore actually has, I think, played a very important role. I think Singapore often wondered, if you talk to Lee Kuan Yew and others in Singapore, as I'm sure you've done, wondered why India didn't engage more with Southeast Asia under Indira Gandhi, who neglected Asia completely. And even after announcing the Look East policy, why they did so little. Because Singapore actually welcomes a strong Indian involvement in the area. There's a sizable Indian minority, of course, in Singapore, a much honored sizable minority. Recently, Singapore has started investing big time in India, in spite of some worries about Indian forms of business practice, which are a bit alien from Singapore, the lack of infrastructure, all sorts of things that don't come naturally to Singapore. Nevertheless, a very determined effort has been made to invest in India. Indeed, Singapore may grow quite rich off some of those investments. And Singapore serves an extremely useful purpose in bringing all sorts of people together. It brings governments together, but more importantly, in a way, it brings non-governmental actors together, be they researchers, be they commentators. Singapore really has become action central for human exchange on international relations, strategic policy, and so on in Asia writ large. And it's an admirable success by Singapore, I'd say. In that sense, Malaysia doesn't play the same role. Secondly, Malaysia, which in its own way has some admirable successes to its credit, hasn't treated its Indian minority particularly gently. Indeed, it doesn't treat any non-Malay community particularly gently. And of course, inevitably, while the Indian government doesn't interfere on this, everybody in India has noticed. Malaysia is unwise to think that nobody notices how it manages its internal affairs. So I'd say while the bilateral relationship between Malaysia and India is a very good one, the human relationship between India and Malaysia could do with some work in Malaysia.
David Rizalpi from the Crawford School of Economics and Government. Just wondering whether there's any connection at all in the relationship between China and India that might stem from the Marxist movements, whether it's in Nepal, what's happening in Bhutan and northern India recently.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and it was a subject of heated debate again domestically in India some years ago, because early on some of the insurgencies in India do appear to have been supported across the border from China with weapons supply and perhaps even financially. But those were mainly the insurgencies of the Indian Northeast, which continue but have mutated over the years. Today there is no evidence whatsoever of Chinese involvement in them, and indeed China in Nepal was always very ill at ease with the Nepali Maoists. They were irritated that the term Maoism had been appropriated by people they had not been introduced to and felt they had nothing in common with. And so until the Maoists came to power in Nepal, rather surprisingly, in 2008, China had virtually nothing to do with the Nepali Maoists, and there's no evidence it has had anything to do with India's Naxalite leadership, the leadership of the very widespread Maoist insurgency gripping parts of East India and large chunks of central India. But it's certainly something that India had reason to worry about early on and remains somewhat concerned about. But the Chinese have been so diligent at messaging that they aren't supporting any of these, but also at never being caught supporting any of them in recent years, that it's not a huge worry. These insurgencies, though, are a big worry within India. And indeed, Manmohan Singh, the current Prime Minister of India, I think in 2005 or possibly 2006, gave a speech in which he described the Naxalite insurgency as the biggest security threat to India, which it both is and isn't. It is in the sense that it affects more Indians than any other threat. It isn't in the sense that the Naxalites and the Indian security authorities for the moment seem to be at a very murderous standoff rather than the Naxalites having much momentum. That an insurgency can affect about 100 of India's 500 or so districts should be very alarming. So Dr. Singh is right to worry about it. But there's no evidence that Indians at large are terribly worried about it, because unless you live in an insurgency-affected area, it's of no particular concern to you in India. Just as many other aspects of India's domestic politics are a puzzlement to outsiders, we might expect Indian Muslims to be very supportive of their brethren in the Kashmir Valley. They aren't. So the way things divide up in India, what winds up being relevant varies a lot. But as to your question about local Maoists, China and India, it isn't really a big factor, or indeed a factor at all.